I'm very pleased to welcome Ian McArdle, our speaker tonight. This is Ian's third Zoom talk for us in as many months, I think. It's very refreshing to know that Lit and Phil members are so proactive and want to help the Lit and Phil. Ian is a retired university teacher, but he's a long-standing member of the Society and he's a very active volunteer. He has an extremely versatile repertoire of talks, including many aspects of the First World War, aspects of local history, the lives of artists, European literature, to name but a few. But tonight his subject is the Reverend Audrey, and I'd just like Ian to take it away. Thank you very much indeed.
There we are, everybody. Good evening. What I don't understand is that although children, and for that matter parents, have really no direct experience of steam trains on normal railway lines, because in Great Britain they finished in 1968. So although children and parents have no experience, direct experience, and yet the engines, the little ones, the big ones, are well known and continue to be loved by so many people throughout the world, something that would have much surprised the author himself. There's the various engines you remember from your own childhood. There's Thomas, mischievous and naughty. There was Gordon, the boastful, proud one. There was Henry, who was usually rather grumpy. Edward, the put-upon one, the hard-working, quiet one. There was Percy, who gets into all sorts of scrapes and doesn't look very happy when he went off the end of the quayside. And we should be in no doubt about how successful the railway series were and still are. In the familiar oblong shape that we're used to, they've sold now more than 25 million books. You can double that figure if you take into account all the variations. I mean, books like the board books, hardboard books, pop-up books, sticker books, etc., etc. And from the books, of course, there has been diversification into a TV series that ran to more than 100 films. There's character licensing of over 800 products that have in particular the Thomas logo. There's the die-cast metal toys. There's lunch boxes with Thomas on them, duvet covers, toothbrushes, Thomas spaghetti shapes, probably Thomas underpants for all I would know. And the person that we must thank for all the enjoyment and pleasure that has been given to children and their parents is this gentleman you see here, Wilbert Vere Audrey. And I want first of all just to talk very briefly about his family background, in particular his father and mother, who were great influences on this very nice man. His father was a reverend also. He was called the Reverend Vere Audrey, and we can see that his son inherited partly his name. Well, the Reverend Vere Audrey had a very full life, but one marked with something like 5 major tragedies. The first of those was his first wife died in childbirth in 1889, leaving him with little Hildred. But within 2 years, Hildred herself had died of convulsions. Vere, I mean Wilbert Vere Audrey's father, Vere remarried quite quickly, and a daughter, Bridget, and a son, Carol, were born from the second marriage. But the third tragedy was that Bridget died from appendicitis in 1900. And then there was a fourth tragedy. Vere's second wife died of cancer in 1908. And sometime after Wilbert, we refer to our hero as Wilbert this evening, Sometime after Wilbert was born, there was a fifth tragedy when Carol, Vere Audrey's first son, the apple of his eyes, was shot and killed, shot through the lungs on the 27th of August 1914 at the Battle of Mons. The supreme tragedy of my father's life, so said his son Wilbert. Well, before that final tragedy had happened, Vere Audrey had married for a third time, 1909. And this time he married a Lucy Burt. And from that marriage, Wilbert is born in 1911 at Amfield Vicarage in Romsey, Hampshire. Wilbert, which is an odd name, is Wilfred Herbert, his father's brothers. Wilbert's father, Vere Audrey, was now 57 years old and was something like more like a grandfather to Wilbert than a father. Anyway, Wilbert grew up in a happy, secure household. He was a lively little boy. He enjoyed the children's favourites of the time. I'm thinking of Goldilocks and the Three Bears, Alice in Wonderland, the Just So stories, the tale of the Flopsy Bunnies. In theory, of course, being a very religious household, he was not allowed comics such as Rainbow, with disreputable, mischievous characters like the Bruin Boys, or here Tiger Tim, who was a rather naughty tiger. Well, of course, you can guess what happened. Those were the very stories that Wilbert was most attracted to. He loved this comic more than anything else. And the comic Tiger Tim and the Bruin Boys may well have been the inspiration for some of Wilbert's own engine characters. And Wilbert's mother, Lucy, would also invent stories and make them up into simple illustrated child-sized books. She was, in other words, sowing in Wilbert's young imagination the seeds of a storytelling tradition. Wilbert came to love engines very early in life, and that passion would remain with him throughout. It's not hard to say why he got interested. He had ample opportunity. He loved to read his father's copies of the railway magazine. Long before he could read the words, he would pore over pictures and photographs in the magazines. And later, Wilbert would become a serious railway modeller, and he developed a passion for heritage railways, in particular the Tallychlyn in North Wales. In later life, Wilbert would look back and reminisce on some of the adventures that he had as a very little boy, which left strong impressions upon him. His elder half-brother Carol, the one tragically to meet his end in the war, of course, Carol and Wilbert got on very well despite their difference in age, and Wilbert soon started to take an interest in the AMR, the Amfield Model Railway, which must have been marvellous for a child. It was a large outdoor railway. It had a steam locomotive and carriages, but all the buildings and accessories had been built by Vere and Carol. The family also were fortunate, or maybe unfortunate, to live near the main Southampton-Salisbury railway line. In Wilbert, quite illegally, Carol and his father would scramble up the embankment and walk along the trackside ballast to where the right-of-way widened and wait for engines to come along. Highly illegal, of course, trespassing. He remembers visits to the line-side huts, which have disappeared unless you're very quick indeed in spotting one, to the line-side huts, dirty, untidy, smoky, full of mysterious tools. Wilbert remembers chatting with the platelayers, and he must have absorbed something of the atmosphere of those days, which stayed with him for the rest of his life. After Carol died and Wilbert's father retired, the family moved to the village of Box, which is near Bath on the main Bristol-Paddington line. Wilbert's house was near the point where the line climbed on a gradient of about 1 in 100, and therefore a banking engine was kept in the locomotive shed to assist heavy freight trains, usually up the incline. And these usually were night trains. And Wilbert could still remember in later life lying in bed, listening to the two engines, the main engine on the front and the banking engine pushing, the two engines talking to each other. And he uses that idea in the very first of all stories, where Edward will help Gordon push his wagons up the hill. "I can't do it. I can't do it," gasps Gordon. Edward, much more upbeat, "Yes, you can. Yes, you can. Yes, you can." So Wilbert grew up, as I said, in a happy, stable environment. He was sent to several private schools. And then in 1929, it was decided that he should try for a university degree. And on the strength of a letter of recommendation from his headmaster, he was offered a place at what was then St. Peter's Hall in 1929. Now it's a full college of Oxford University. A new college offering opportunities to boys from relatively low-income families. Well, he certainly seems to have enjoyed his time there. He was a keen sportsman, perhaps not a very keen student, however, because he came out with what he describes as a brilliant third gamma plus degree. But he enjoyed his time very much, but did not manage to distinguish himself academically. But it was while he was here at St. Peter's that he began to consider seriously his own attitude towards the Christian faith, and it began to have a personal meaning for him. You see, at home, although his father was a reverend, religion had never been forced upon him, a wise move in my opinion. Since there was no real compulsion about religion, there was nothing to rebel against, said Wilbert, and I grew up taking that tolerant attitude for granted, an attitude he would also pass on to his 3 children, one of whom also became a reverend. But Wilbert came to believe that he had a vocation for the priesthood, but he also admitted it was simply the best option available to him, a profession he already knew quite a lot about. So he moves up the Banbury Road in 1932 to Wycliffe College, a theological college. He passes the diploma in theology, and he's offered a 3-year contract teaching a wide range of subjects in Jerusalem. So in 1933, we find Wilbert in St. George's School, which is a multiracial school in Jerusalem, Christian, Jewish, and Muslim children, where all pupils receive teaching in the Christian faith. And for Wilbert, it was a very valuable experience. He was moving out into the wider world. He mixed with different types and classes and races. He developed skills in communication. He liberated himself from his mother's overpowering influence, and his own faith became, of course, more vivid as he visited biblical sites of the Old and the New Testament. Then something happened to Wilbert in 1936. He'd always been very shy and reticent with girls, but while acting as a guide, he met a Margaret Whale, a teacher in the English high school in Haifa. And that relationship slowly developed. And during a 6-day trip to the city of Petra, he asks her and is accepted. He asks to marry her, and he is accepted. However, he must return in 1936 to Wycliffe Hall in Oxford to take his exam to become a deacon. He is then ordained at Winchester and accepts a post as curate at Odiham in Hampshire. Unfortunately, his relations with the vicar at Odiham were strained. Wilbert is young, naive, and rather enthusiastic. His ideas, modern ideas, much better than the stuffy old ideas. He doesn't get on very well with his landlady either. He invites a group of RAF personnel. Remember, this is 1936, 3 years before the war. He invites a group of RAF personnel to tea in his lodgings. The landlady is aghast. How dare he invite such riff-raff? And he gives Wilbert notice to quit. Well, relations with the vicar at Odiham continue to be poor. I didn't get much training, he says. I ended up mainly as a signpost to the vicarage front door. But in 1938, he and Margaret get married, and it was a very successful marriage, which lasted for a long, long time indeed. They continued to have their own separate interests, but they drew on each other's support throughout their long and happy marriage. Wilbert now accepts a new position as curate at Great Cheverel in Wiltshire. A much busier problem, but I'm afraid there's still relationship problems. There was, you see, a sharp difference in political views between Wilbert, a pacifist, and Percival Sexty, the vicar, who wasn't. Wilbert became a member of the Anglican Pacifist Fellowship, which was just too much for his vicar, and he was asked to leave. Well, what will he do? He's asked to leave. Where will he go? Well, as it happens, there is a vacancy in 1940 in Birmingham. We come to that in a moment. War is about to be declared. On the 2nd of September 1939, life seemed fairly normal, I suppose. A packet of players, still a shilling, bottle of Guinness, 7p. Arsenal beat Sunderland 5-2. But on the following day, war is declared, and Wilbert makes the best of things and just gets on with it. He's still in Cheverel in Wiltshire. He hasn't moved to Birmingham yet. He's made the billeting officer. His job is to allocate evacuee children to families, some of whom were willing, some were not. He presided, he tells us, over scenes reminiscent of a cross between an early Roman slave market and a Selfridges bargain basement. I want that child. I don't want that one. It must have been a very, very difficult job indeed to be billeting officer. And Wilbert and Margaret themselves take in some East London East End children. Apparently they were chronic bedwetters and terribly afraid of Audrey's puppy dog, Toby. But good news in 1940 for them. Their son, their only son, has 2 daughters as well. Their son Christopher is born in July in Devizes. Well, in 1940, as we know, the relationship between him and his vicar finally breaks down. Wilbert, fortunately, comes to the attention of the pacifist Bishop of Birmingham, and he's offered a curacy at King's Norton. Now, that probably wasn't a very healthy place because of the attentions of the Luftwaffe. It was a huge parish of 50,000 with many important industrial targets, including the Austin Longbridge works. Nevertheless, Wilbert claimed that those years were the happiest years of his career. I was thrown in at the deep end and as a result learned a tremendous amount. But we're going to leave there the biographical details, which are not so important, as to try to consider next how it, and I think you know what I mean by it, all got started. Well, I'll tell you how. In 1943, poor little Christopher gets measles, and he lies in bed feeling pretty miserable for himself. And he always loved this poem, Early in the morning, down at the station, all the little engines standing in a row. Along comes the driver, pulls a little lever, puff, puff, chuff, chuff, off they go. Well, to go with the poem, Wilbert draws for his little son a picture of some engines with different faces. One of the faces is a very sad face, and that's the one that appeals most to Christopher, Wilbert's son. Why is he sad, Daddy? Because he hasn't been out for a long time. What's his name, Daddy? Edward, the first name that pops into Wilbert's head. And so Wilbert makes up a story about Edward's day out, as he called it, when Edward is allowed out of the shed and pulls his own train and has a lovely day. It goes down quite well with Christopher. He writes another story, does Wilbert, Edward and Gordon. And this is the one where Edward helped push Gordon up the hill. Gordon was named after a little bossy boy who lived nearby, apparently. Well, you know what kids are like. He's had two stories. That's surely enough now. Oh, no, I'm afraid he demands a third story. And this story is called The Sad Story of Henry. Henry refuses to come out of a tunnel because it was raining and he'd get his paint all wet. So what happens? The tunnel is bricked up. Now notice, this will be relevant in a minute, that in the illustration there are actually two tunnel bores there. But that caused a problem later, but that's not to worry about. Anyway, Henry refuses to come out of the tunnel and he's bricked in. And we also meet for the first time the fat director, later called Sir Topham Hatt, the fat controller. This portly gentleman will develop into a firm but kindly character who has an awesome godlike status with powers to reward and punish. Wilbert felt that such a character gave children the idea that someone is in control of the world. In other words, ladies and gentlemen, there is a moral purpose to the stories. And I think that's quite important and sets itself perhaps apart from many other children's stories. By the way, I should have said that this idea of having steam trains have human characteristics was not an original idea of Wilbert's. There was Casey Jr. in Walt Disney's Reluctant Dragon, who pulled Dumbo in a circus, and that was in 1941. There was Choo Choo, the story of a little red engine who ran away, by Diana Ross, and various other ones as well. Well, children have very good memories, and if Wilbert made a mistake in reciting the stories, he was soon put right. So Wilbert decides to scribble down the stories exactly in the same way so that he can refer to what he actually said, so that he can't be caught out by his son anymore. Well, except for a chance, that would be the end of our little story tonight. He would write and scribble down a few stories, draw a few poor illustrations. And as Christopher grew up, they would probably just be consigned to the waste paper basket. But then Margaret, Wilbert's wife, who knew nothing about agents or publishing, she takes a hand quite sensibly, and she suggests that these three stories might find a publisher despite severe wartime paper shortages. This is in 1943. Well, eventually the stories, surprise, surprise, are accepted by Edward Ward Publishers, and Wilbert is actually offered a payment of £25. And he takes it. He's surprised that anyone should be eager to purchase the stories, just written in pencil, sent in on just bits of paper, not a polished, finished job. Anyway, Edward Ward say that's fine, but the book must have a fourth story. And all the stories actually contain 4 mini stories. Each book has 4 mini stories. So Wilbert decides to liberate Henry from the tunnel, and he set about writing a fourth story called Edward, Gordon, and Henry. Not quite right yet, however. Wilbert is asked to increase the number of repetitions, something which children enjoy. Edward pushing Gordon up the hill. Pull hard, pull hard, pull hard, puffed Edward. Gordon, his pride hurt because he's pulling a smelly, dirty goods train. A goods train, a goods train, a goods train. The shame of it, the shame of it. Now, they have to be illustrated, and Wilbert was no great illustrator. Well, they eventually find an illustrator, a William Middleton, but he turned out to be a disappointment. Wilbert was required to submit rough illustrations to William Middleton, but at least Wilbert had been very careful with wheel arrangement and shape, so that Christopher could tell the engines apart. However, William Middleton didn't take accuracy anything like so serious. So both Henry and Gordon had the same 4-6-2 wheel arrangement, and the faces were clumsily drawn. The two engines were difficult to tell apart, apparently. Remember those tunnels? Well, Henry refused to come out of the tunnel, and according to the text, a new tunnel needed to be cut. But if you remember back, I'll just whip back for a moment, there are already two tunnels in the illustration, not in the text, but it makes no sense, of course, because you wouldn't cut another tunnel if there is a second one already available. So it made nonsense of the text. So there was a bit of a fight went on there. Anyway, eventually the problems are solved, and this is not a first edition cover. These illustrations, in fact, are much more proficient than the original ones. But in 1945, The Three Railway Engines is published, 22,500 copies in the small oblong format, well suited to a child's hands and pockets. And then two further impressions are issued shortly after. The book has been a success. The second book, Thomas the Tank Engine. Wilbert had built a push-along model of Edward, but then Wilbert made a second model of an 060 tank engine from a piece of broomstick. You can see the actual engine here, from a piece of broomstick for the boiler, a metal tube for the chimney, and flattened out carpet wheels for the wheels. This was Thomas the Tank Engine. And on the side was the number 1, simply because it was the easiest number to draw. Well, having built a little engine for Christopher, now I hope recovered from his measles, Christopher now wanted stories about Thomas, and Wilbert sets to work for a second time, fitting in his writing around his numerous church duties. Really, he had, if you like, 2 careers, very hard, strenuous to keep both going. Of all the engines anyway, children seem to have the greatest affection for Thomas, mischievous, but with a happy-go-lucky personality, very close to many children. He was a cheeky little engine. He thought no engine worked as hard as he did, so he used to play tricks on the other engines. He liked best of all to come quietly up beside a big engine dozing on a siding and make him jump. Beep, 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 beep. Wake up, lazy bones, he would whistle. Why don't you work hard like me? And in the 4 stories, Thomas got into trouble with Gordon, and then he dashed off without his coaches, which hadn't been coupled up. He had problems with troublesome trucks, but finally in the 4th story, he was rewarded with his own branch line when he helped a new engine, James, when the latter's wooden brake blocks caught fire. And this story, and this is significant, this story is based on a true incident. when an LMS goods train ran away on the Lickey Incline, which is at Longbridge, Birmingham, if you like. Well, the first illustrator won't do. So another one is found, a Reginald Payne, an Admiralty artist is chosen. Wilbert is again obliged, rather unwillingly, to submit rough sketches for the new artist to work upon, but at least the end result is a lot better. You see, Payne would actually use a real engine, or real engine design, exactly like this one, an 060 tank engine. He would use a real design, so he's working from a position of authenticity. Wilbert receives £45 and Payne £94. Thomas the Tank Engine is finally published in December of 1946. And then, to Wilbert's utter amazement, he's asked to produce one new book every year. Such is the popularity of the series, and Wilbert would continue to do that with only 1 year missing until 1972. Wilbert gradually developed a system. He wrote numerous drafts, gradually reducing down to 80, 90 words per page. The record apparently was 26 revisions for just 1 page. Well, unfortunately, the illustrator, Reginald Payne, although he had his problems, suffered ill health. So he couldn't continue to work. And another illustrator, also called Reginald Dolby, was chosen as the new illustrator. Dolby's pictures were very good, with lively scenes and bright colours, in contrast to most books of the period. Unfortunately, engineering accuracy was still not the strong point of the illustrators. For example, James's connecting rods passed right through the centre of the axles, so the wheels, of course, couldn't possibly turn. Well, the collaboration between Wilbert and Reginald Dolby lasted long enough. It lasted until 1956, but the two men did not really get on very well together, and they only ever met twice. Wilbert claimed that his patience was sorely tested, and Dolby claimed that Wilbert was a pedantic, remote man with whom cooperation was difficult. I guess Wilbert was probably fairly stubborn. How could you be anything else if you were trying to hold down really what have become two careers, the demanding work of the church and the similarly demanding work of writing 1 book a year? Anyway, being committed to 1 book a year, Wilbert now writes James the Red Engine, and then in 1949, Thomas the Tank Engine Again. It's called Thomas the Tank Engine Again, and here another character is introduced, Bertie the Bus. And Thomas challenges him to a race, but at a level crossing, Bertie is held up. Wilbert's by now 3 children object to this. It's not fair. Thomas will win, of course, because the level crossing has stopped Bertie from moving on. That's not fair. Wilbert gets into an argument with his kids. He claims he gave the Thomas and Bertie, each contestant, the same number of articles. And to prove his point, he draws a map. There are on the map road and railway, traffic lights, level crossings, bridges, tunnels, rivers. Wilbert even drew on contour lines, and he had some place names. Dry Ore, anagram for Audrey. Tory Wreck, anagram for rectory, or a name with Welsh connections, Farquhar, far away quarry. And he develops the idea, so the island of Sodor is born in Thomas the Tank Engine Again. Wilbert realizes that the stories need to be given a location. Where should Sodor be? Well, on a trip to the Isle of Man in 1950, Wilbert discovered that the bishop had the title of Bishop of Sodor and Man. The name Sodor apparently comes from the Sudreys, the ancient name for islands off the west coast of Scotland. And Wilbert, as you can just about see in the picture, locates his island, the Isle of Sodor, between the Isle of Man and Barrow in Furness. And later he will go on to write a highly detailed fictional account, obviously, of the island with his brother George, the island of Sodor, its people, history and railways in extreme detail. And so the stories came year after year. And we move on to, if you like, the third part of our little talk, just what was, I can't really answer the question, I threw out a few ideas. What was the appeal of these stories, which were meant, of course, to be read aloud to your children? Well, I can think of a few obvious things. The language used. Wilbert liked to introduce unfamiliar words to children that he thought, nevertheless, would be alluring to them. Words like dawdling, nuisance, swerved, anxiously. He is aware of the value of onomatopoeia. Chuff, chuff, beep, beep, ah, shoo, shoo. There is a varied and amusing vocabulary. He doesn't talk of an engine as being all hot and bothered. It's all steam and connecting rods. Then this is an important point. He insists on exact railway terminology. In Gallant Old Engine 1962, Peter Sam, this is Peter Sam, collects with an icicle in a tunnel and has to make do with a wired-on drain pipe for a funnel. But the solution to the problem is to fit what is technically called a Giesel funnel, I believe. This was very up-to-date, but it looks flat and rather funny looking, which was handy, of course, as well. Children would laugh at the funny but highly efficient Giesel funnel. And each book, except the first, of course, began with a letter to the young readers, as if they are part of Wilbert's family. And also Wilbert makes deliberate connections between the books. The same characters reappear and there are references, cross-references back to earlier books. The drawings, of course, are extremely, at least the later ones, are extremely attractive. But Wilbert insisted on strict technical accuracy. He didn't always get it, but he did his best. Wilbert's engines, you see, are based, of course, on real engines. And he drew for this on his vast experience as a model railway enthusiast and as a volunteer on preserved railways, such as I mentioned, the Tully-Flynn, where he gave many, many years of devoted service as a volunteer. So there's the language, there are the beautiful drawings, but there are also, and I've hinted at this already, the moral values of the books. In Henry the Green Engine, 1951, there are vandals, silly, stupid boys, although they all seem extremely smartly dressed. The one in the middle certainly has a tie on, but look what they're doing. They're attacking Henry by throwing stones, but they are dealt with. Henry returns to the scene, sneezes smoke and ashes all over the boys who are filthy. And he actually uses a simile there that in politically correct times I could no longer repeat. But the boys were totally black with the soot and the ashes from Henry. In 1954, in Edward and the Blue Engine, two boys had released James's brake lever, but they, of course, are caught by the police and soundly walloped by their fathers. He involves children. Children notice discrepancies. Infuriatingly, I think we'll have had this experience ourselves. And Wilbert always tried to offer plausible reasons in his replies to the children's correspondence. And he was an assiduous replier to the correspondence. He built up a vast correspondence over the years, showing his insistence on accuracy, credibility, and his respect for children. So, for example, in the 3 railway engines, in the very first picture, there were 6 engines in the shed, but 2 of them never reappear. Why is that, please? They were horrid engines, replies Wilbert. They were horrid engines. So the fat director sent them away again, and that is why there are no stories about them. In Thomas the Tank Engine again, Henry has oblong buffers, whereas in the 3 railway engines, he had round buffers, the things children will notice. Well, Wilbert offers you a choice of 2 explanations. One, Henry's buffers had got rusty while he was in the tunnel. Remember, he was bricked up in the tunnel. The buffers were replaced with the only spares available, so he ended up with oblong buffers like Gordon's. Or if you don't want that explanation, children, Henry was so pleased on getting out of the tunnel that he ran into a buffer stop and broke his round buffers. The workshop only had oblong buffers available. I think one of the reasons for the lasting success is, as I've said, the stories are based on fact mingled with fiction, but there's a solid basis of fact, and Wilbert used many real events in his stories. He found it difficult, of course, always to come up with new ideas, but his brother George, who was a librarian, passed on back numbers of Railway Gazette, and these were an important source of inspiration, so that in James the Red Engine, James develops a leak in a brake pipe, which is fixed with newspaper and bootlaces. You can see the gentleman rather unhappily handing over his bootlaces. Apparently, this was a real event. Or in Thomas the Tank Engine again, Thomas steams out of the station without his guard. This was an event related in the Railway Gazette, where the guard had tripped over an old lady's umbrella and the train had left without him. Or a personal reminiscence of an embarrassing moment when Wilbert was working in Tallychlyn as a volunteer. He gave the all away signal and the train puffed out of the station, leaving behind Mrs. Davies, the angry tea lady. However, Wilbert was careful always how he portrayed engine men. I made it a rule, he says, that no shadow of blame should fall on them for any mishap. It was always the engine's fault. In the late 50s, steam was beginning to be phased out on British railways, something that Wilbert took very much to heart and which we find in his stories. In Duck and the Diesel Engine, 1958, Wilbert disliked diesels. And so Diesel is a smooth-talking villain, and he looks a bit of a villain. Well, the end of steam had already been foreseen. In Stepney, the Bluebell engine of 1963, we read, engines on the other railway, by which he meant British railways, in contrast to the Isle of Sodor railway. Engines on the other railway aren't safe now. Their controllers are cruel. They put the engines on cold, damp sidings, and then, Percy nearly sobbed, they cut them up. In 1968, in enterprising engines, it was too late. 1968 was the final year of steam on British railways. Cheer up, Gordon, said the fat controller. I can't, sir. I keep thinking about the dreadful state of the world. Well, not only was steam under threat, but the very existence of railways was also under threat. The 1950s and 60s saw a serious decline in railway traffic. In Toby the Tank Engine, 1952, Henrietta, who is Toby's coach, grumbles it's not fair at all. The buses would roar past full of passengers. She remembers she used to be full, and 9 trucks would rattle behind her. Now there are only 3 or 4, for the farms and factories send their goods mostly by lorry. People come to see Toby, but they come by bus. They stare at him. Isn't he quaint, they say. They make him so cross. And then in 1969, in Oliver, the Western Engine, there's the threat from road competition. Pah, snorted Bulgy the bus. Enjoyments all you engines live for, taking the petrols from the tanks of us workers. Come the revolution, railways will be ripped up. Cars and coaches will trample their remains. Free the roads, he growled from railway tyranny. But ladies and gentlemen, the appeal of Thomas and his friends went on. And it went on, of course, beyond books. And as early as 1953, the BBC proposed televising 2 stories from the 3 railway engines. But viewers, probably watching on their 12-inch television screens, pie television screens, would often see the model trains derailing and a giant hand appeared in the background, putting them back on track. The series was dropped in a public fiasco. And it was many years later, in 1979, that a television producer, Britt Allcroft, stepped in. During the making of a film of the Bluebell line in Sussex, in which Wilbert had taken part, Britt had become intrigued by the characters and the simplicity of the stories. And she negotiated the television rights with the publishers, not with Wilbert. She negotiated the television rights for a reputed sum of only £50,000. And she started to make a series of films called Thomas the Tank Engine and Friends, which ran to over 100 films. And who should be chosen to read the scripts? A certain Ringo Starr. He had a railway voice, a rich Liverpudlian street drawl. Ringo, of course, was known to a whole generation of parents, and as a pop icon, he could hardly go unnoticed. Well, Ringo modestly credited the success of these new recordings to the original stories, and he and Wilbert got on very well. Wilbert even invited him to his home, and Ringo arrived in a blue satin jacket, driving his bronze Mercedes. What a contrast with Wilbert, now quite an old man, in an old jacket, slightly stooping, with a wooden control box round his neck, playing with his model trains. They spent hours, apparently, with Wilbert's model railway, while poor Ringo's wife remained in the house, catatonic with boredom. Well, by now, the railway series had sold more than 8 million copies. And in 85-86, earnings were £71,000, and within 5 years they exceeded £1 million, thanks to TV and the spin-offs, by which I mean the character merchandising. Britt Allcroft had the idea, starting with jigsaw puzzles in 1984, and at Harrogate Toy Fair, she tried to interest companies in buying a license to use the engines on a variety of toys and games and puzzles. Most of the dealers at Harrogate Toy Fair thought she was mad. Today's generation haven't ridden on a train, let alone seen a steam engine. Well, how wrong can you be? The Thomas image has become a potent symbol for Britt Allcroft Thomas Limited, a company set up by Britt Allcroft. There are fancy dress costumes, birthday cakes, ice sculptures in Japan, entrance even in the London Marathon. And in 1988, Thomas the Tank Engine and Friends is launched in America under the name of Shining Time Station. It's an instant success with crowds of 25,000 turning out to see Thomas on his whistle-stop tour in New York. There's even a musical stage show, Shining Time Station. And Thomas even appears in Bill Clinton's inaugural parade when he was elected president. Well, not surprisingly, perhaps, Wilbert is not happy with all these new developments. The stories, of course, no longer read like an ordinary text. They certainly don't. There are now two rival Thomases, and Wilbert is pushed into the background somewhat by Allcroft. The television twin soon got greedy, and it was wealth that Wilbert was not really to share in. In 1994, the value of Brit Allcroft Thomas Limited was £50 million, but Wilbert's contribution to the success was hardly recognised. Wilbert had moved as early as 1953 to an ancient village. The village is called Emneth in Norfolk, and he remained happily there until 1965, when he decided to retire from the church, and he moved to Stroud. There were, of course, royalties from the railway series. They earned him about £1,000 a year, so he lived reasonably comfortably. And he continued to have considerable correspondence, not only from children about the engines in his stories, but also from parents who consult him for advice over difficult children. He replied fully and carefully to these letters, something like an agony uncle. But by about 1970, Wilbert, feeling his age, warns his publishers that he's getting rather stale, and in 1971, no new title appears. Following year, however, there is Tramway Engines, which will be Wilbert Awdry's last book. Here, Wilbert introduces Mavis, the diesel engine, who is young and full of herself, but eventually she sees the errors of her ways and is forgiven. Mavis is now a welcome visitor at Farquhar Shed. She's still young and still makes mistakes, but she is never too proud to ask Toby, and Toby always helps her to put things right. And these are the final words of Wilbert's railway series. He had finally drained the wells of fancy dry. But it wasn't the end of the railway series, because Christopher Awdry, Wilbert's son, did go on to write 16 more titles, so that altogether there are 42 in the series, the final one being Thomas and His Friends in 1996. And so I attempt to sum up and ask again, really, what can we put down what can we put success down to? What's the essential factor? We'd probably all differ on this one. For me, I think that the stories are set in a timeless world apart. There's a feel-good factor of optimism and idealism. Everything is well ordered, or usually well ordered in the series. There's always, of course, redemption and forgiveness, the chance to try harder to be a really useful engine. The engines go their own way, they come to a sticky end. When they show they are sorry, however, for their silly trucks, they are forgiven, and they are never, never scrapped. Well, the analogy, ladies and gentlemen, with humans, I think, is more than obvious. The Isle of Soda for children is like a never, never land, similar perhaps to C.S. Lewis's Narnia, or Lewis Carroll's Wonderland, or Tolkien, The Earth, the Middle Earth. The engines, they're just like children. They behave as children do. And for adults, it's a look back to a simpler age. For Wilbert, health problems, of course, begin to occur, spinal problems and leg ulcers and falls. So he resigns some of his voluntary and charitable activities. He makes several attempts at an autobiography, but nothing comes of them. And then, on a trip to Lethdale to speak at the opening of a railway model shop, he receives the very sad news that his wife, Margaret, had died and he was not at her bedside, an event that affects him deeply. He will eventually, however, return home where he was looked after by carers, and Wilbert passed away on the 21st of March 1997, having received an OBE the year before for services to children's literature. Not perhaps a great reward. Wilbert always drew an amusing analogy between the church, reverends, and railways. An analogy was that both the church and railways, they're both regularly assailed by critics, and both are firmly convinced that they are the best means of getting man to his ultimate destination. And in a very later interview, not long before he died, he suggested, laughingly, I think, as an epitaph, but I couldn't agree more really, that he, Wilbert, he helped people to see God in the ordinary things of life, and he made children laugh. Thank you very much, everybody. That is the end of our little talk. Thank you.
Well, Ian, I'd like to thank you very much for yet another fascinating and detailed talk on a subject that obviously means quite a lot to you personally. And
Yes.
if anybody would like to ask a question or make a comment, they can use chat, and you'll receive the chat question, Ian, or you can ask, or people can ask face to face, as it were. Were the books translated into other languages? And
yes, they were, though I think they appealed mainly to an English-speaking audience throughout the Commonwealth. Some of them have been translated into French, and interesting enough, in French, Thomas has changed sex. He's now a girl, and he's called Thomasine in French. So they're certainly known in France, but I think their popularity is mainly the Anglo-Saxon world.
do you think the stories will ever date, or they will live on, really?
Well, you would have thought if they were going to date, it would have happened by now, because they've been around since 1945, haven't they? No, I don't think so, because they deal with universal features of human behavior, don't they? You know, the pride before the fall in Gordon's case, the Edward, the one always put upon, the cheeky, mischievous one. These are traits that are, well, are human traits which will be with us till the end of time. So there doesn't appear to be any sign of that. I have a feeling, however, though, that all the merchandise perhaps overshadows the actual books. But having said that, my grandchildren, they're only 3 or so, they love the stories. So I don't know.
Oh, Alistair?
Hi, Ian, and thanks very much. I just wondered, um, was there anything that you discovered that the Reverend had been sort of involved in with other sort of prominent figures, particularly during the time that the mass railway closures were occurring? Because there's a fairly common and regular theme amongst local and national religious figures getting involved with various campaigns over the years to try and prevent or reverse closures. And
Yes, I don't
you
know
come
if
across
he was certainly very nostalgic about steam engines. I think he would have had to be careful about joining campaigns and going on demonstrations, because after all, we forget that his real work, of course, was in the church. So I think he used his writing to express his personal opinions on the matter. But he certainly didn't get involved with at least, I think I can be certain saying he didn't get involved with the politics of the thing. He let the comments in his books speak for him.
Thanks. Thank you.
Well, if there are no more questions, I'd just like to thank Ian again for giving us his time tonight. And I hope it's not too long before you agree to give us another talk, whether it's on Zoom or in
Yes.
person.
I'll try not to disappear the next time.
And I'd like to thank the audience out there for
Yes.
attending, and for those of you who've already donated via our website. Thank you very much indeed for that. And if you haven't donated and you would like to do so to show your appreciation and to help us continue our educational work, you can do that either on the website or via our YouTube channel. The instructions are there. So on that note, thank you again, and good night, everybody.
Good night, everybody. Bye-bye now.